The factory floor of green bamboo flooring vibrated with the relentless, heavy thud of hydraulic presses. It was a rhythmic, bone-deep pulse that dictated the pace of every worker in the building. Metal groaned against wood, a constant high-pitched screech that punctuated the deeper, rhythmic boom of the primary line. Elias stood at the edge of the conveyor belt, his eyes tracking the steady flow of raw timber moving toward the cutters. He felt the floor shudder through the soles of his boots, a mechanical heartbeat that had become his only constant. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and heated oil, a heavy haze that clung to the rafters. He adjusted his stance, bracing against the vibration, and leaned closer to the intake. Elias kept his focus locked on the incoming material, his jaw set, waiting for the first sign of the inevitable failure. Elias grabbed the next stalk from the conveyor. It felt wrong in his grip, the weight uneven and shifting. He pulled it away from the line and pressed it firmly against his metal gauge. The wood bowed nearly 2 inches in the center, a clear, jagged arc that defied the straight edge of the tool. He pushed his palm against the curve, trying to flatten it, but the timber resisted, springing back with a dull thud. It was useless. He cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed by the roar of the presses. He turned and tossed the stalk into the reject bin. It landed with a hollow clatter atop a mountain of identical failures. The bin was already overflowing, stalks spilling onto the concrete floor in a tangled mess. Elias stared at the pile. It was not just one bad batch. It was the entire shipment. He realized the line was processing nothing but scrap, and the quota was slipping further away with every passing second. He wiped his hands on his palms, the grit of the wood clinging to his skin. Elias marched off the factory floor, his boots striking the concrete with sharp, rhythmic intent. He bypassed the main aisle and shoved open the door to the administrative wing. Inside, the air was still, a stark contrast to the mechanical chaos. Marcus sat behind his desk, a pen poised over a stack of invoices. Elias did not wait for an invitation. He stepped forward and slammed the warped stalk onto the polished mahogany surface. The wood skidded, knocking a glass of water to the edge of the desk. "These are unusable," Elias said, his voice tight and low. "The machines cannot process curves. We are missing our daily quota by 30%. Marcus did not flinch. He slowly set his pen down, his gaze shifting from the wood to Elias with calculated indifference. He leaned back, tapping his chin with the end of his pen. "The supplier is cheap, Elias. Make it work. Adjust the pressure settings." Elias gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, but Marcus had already turned his attention back to the screen. Elias walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The sound of the factory floor rushed back, a rhythmic, thundering pulse that seemed to mock his failure. He stood at the threshold, watching the conveyor belt churn. The machines were not designed for the warped timber, yet he had been ordered to force them. He walked toward the main press, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He stopped by the control panel, staring at the gauges. The needles hovered near the red zones, already strained by the irregular pressure of the bowed stalks. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy wrench, the metal cold against his palm. His hands were still stained with sawdust from the morning shift. He looked at the emergency stop button, then at the line of rejected wood waiting to be processed. The choice was clear. He leaned over the console, unscrewing the primary casing to expose the internal gears. The scent of hot oil and ozone filled the air. Elias braced his shoulder against the steel frame of the primary press. He wrenched the pressure valve a quarter turn, the metal biting into his palms. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping into his eyes, but he did not blink. He grabbed a heavy iron bar and jammed it into the gear housing. Leveraging the mechanism to force the alignment, the machine shuddered. A high-pitched whine erupted from the motor as he pushed the pressure settings into the red. He hauled a warped stalk from the pile, his muscles screaming as he slammed it into the feed slot. The press descended, but the wood buckled, jamming the intake. Elias cursed, grabbing a mallet to strike the feeder until the timber snapped into place. He leaned his entire weight against the lever, his boots sliding on the oil-slicked concrete. The hydraulic system groaned, a deep, metallic protest that vibrated through his bones. He adjusted the tension bolts again, his fingers raw and trembling. With a final guttural grunt, he shoved the wood forward. The press slammed down. The machine roared, the metal teeth grinding against the grain. and the first piece of warped flooring slid out the other side. It was jagged, but it held. He wiped his face with a stained forearm. The machine was still fighting him. Every time the press descended, the automatic sensors detected the misalignment and triggered a hard shutdown. Elias stared at the flashing red light on the control panel, his chest heaving. He had minutes to meet the hourly quota, or the entire line would be flagged for downtime. He reached for the secondary casing, his fingers moving with frantic precision. He pulled a length of copper wire from his toolkit and bridged the connection on the primary sensor board. The red light flickered and died. He bypassed the emergency cutoff switch, taping the contact shut with heavy-duty adhesive. The press roared back to life, the motor vibrating with a higher, more dangerous pitch than before. He fed the next warped stalk into the maw of the machine. The safety guard was now useless, a hollow shell that no longer stopped the piston. He stood inches from the moving steel, watching the hydraulic fluid leak from a strained hose. He did not tighten the seal. He simply reached for the next piece of timber, his eyes fixed on the output belt. The machine was running blind, pushed past every limit, and he was the only thing keeping it from tearing itself apart. He fed another stalk, then another, ignoring the smell of burning rubber that began to fill the air. The wall clock clicked to midnight. The factory floor was a landscape of shadows and rhythmic thudding steel. Elias stood at the end of the conveyor, his hands resting on the cold metal railing. The machine was no longer screaming. The erratic, grinding protest of the gears had smoothed into a steady, relentless cadence. Each piece of flooring emerged from the press with a sharp, consistent snap, sliding onto the belt in perfect, unbroken succession. He watched the output pile grow, the wood stacked with a precision that seemed impossible given the warped nature of the raw material. His legs felt like lead, and the tremors in his fingers had become a constant, dull ache. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped the grease from his palms, his breath finally slowing to a steady rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sawdust, but for the first time in 6 hours, the emergency alarms remained silent. He stood there for a long minute, letting the silence of the finished task settle over him, his exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by the cold, hard reality of his success. Elias stepped away from the line, his boots heavy against the concrete. He walked to the control terminal, the screen glowing with a harsh, blue light that burned his tired eyes. He navigated through the production logs, his fingers moving stiffly over the keyboard. A system error flashed across the monitor, warning of a potential data mismatch due to the bypass sensors. He ignored the prompt, typing in the override codes with practiced speed. He needed the report to show a clean, perfect yield. He watched the progress bar crawl toward completion. Finally, the printer hummed to life, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet office. He pulled the document from the tray, the paper still warm from the internal heater. He scanned the columns of numbers, confirming the quota was met in full. The data was flawless. It was the physical proof of his labor, a tangible record of the 6 hours he had spent wrestling. Elias stepped out of the factory floor, the heavy steel door swinging shut behind him with a final muffled thud. The transition was jarring. The constant vibrating roar of the presses vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it made his ears ring. He walked down the long, carpeted corridor leading to the executive wing. The air here was different, lacking the metallic tang of sawdust, smelling instead of stale coffee and expensive floor wax. He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking, the fine tremors betraying the 6 hours of brutal manual labor he had just endured. He wiped them against his sides, but the grit remained. He reached the end of the hall. The office door was made of solid, polished mahogany, standing as a silent barrier between the chaos and the calm. He paused, his breath hitching in his chest. He felt the weight of the report in his pocket, the paper edges sharp against his leg. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the brass handle. The office beyond was perfectly still, a vacuum of authority. Elias pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The space was cavernous, dominated by a desk that looked carved from a single dark slab of wood. Sterling sat behind it, his head bowed, the blue light from a tablet reflecting off his glasses. He did not look up. Elias walked forward, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet. He reached the desk and laid the report down, the white paper stark against the dark surface. He waited. He expected a nod, a question, or at least a glance at the numbers he had bled for. Sterling continued to scroll, his thumb moving with a rhythmic, indifferent flick. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Elias cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive. He pointed to the report, his fingers trembling, but Sterling only adjusted his position, his eyes locked on the supply chain logs displayed on the monitor. He did not acknowledge the paper. He did not acknowledge the man standing before him. The air felt thin, drained of oxygen by the sheer weight of the man's disinterest. Sterling finally tapped the screen, locking the tablet with a sharp click. He leaned back, his chair creaking in the quiet room. He did not look at the report Elias had placed on the desk. Instead, he gestured toward the wall-mounted monitor, where a series of green graphs spiked upward. "Marcus saved us 20% on procurement costs this quarter," Sterling said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He turned his head, his gaze finally meeting Elias, though his eyes remained distant. "That is the kind of efficiency I value. It is a remarkable turnaround." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He thought of the 6 hours spent forcing warped timber into the molds, the sweat soaking through his shirt, and the smell of burning wood that still clung to his skin. He had sacrificed his own health to cover for the very materials Sterling was now praising. "The machines were never meant to handle that grade of timber," Elias managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Sterling waved a hand dismissively, his attention already drifting back to the glowing supply chain logs. "Numbers do not lie, Elias. Marcus found a way to make the bottom line grow." Sterling shifted his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he finally focused entirely on Elias. The coldness in his expression was absolute, a clinical assessment that stripped away years of dedication in a single heartbeat. He tapped his finger against the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gavel. "You, however, have been complaining about the raw materials for weeks," Sterling stated, his voice dropping into a register of flat disappointment. He gestured toward the factory floor beyond the office glass. "Your inability to adapt to the supplies is a bottleneck, Elias. It is a persistent, unnecessary friction." The word hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Bottleneck. Elias felt the term strike him with more force than a physical blow. His hands, still rough from the sawdust and the grueling manual labor of the night, clenched at his sides. He watched Sterling turn back to the monitor, the man already moving on to the next set of procurement figures. Elias took a sharp breath, his throat tight. He needed to speak, to force the reality of the factory floor into this pristine, quiet office. "The machines are failing, sir," he began, his voice raspy from the long hours of shouting over the presses. "I had to bypass every safety protocol just to keep the line moving. It is not a matter of adaptation. It is a matter of mechanical collapse." He stepped forward, his boots leaving faint traces of sawdust on the polished floor. He wanted to show his hands, to point out the raw, red skin, where the metal had bitten into his palms during the manual recalibration. He opened his mouth to describe the sound of the gears grinding, the heat radiating from the overworked motors, and the imminent danger to the staff. But Sterling did not turn around. He did not even blink. With a slow, languid motion, Sterling waved his hand through the air, a gesture that cut Elias off as cleanly as a blade. "Focus on your job, Elias," Sterling commanded. "Marcus is the one who keeps this company profitable. Do not waste my time with excuses." The dismissal was absolute. The air in the office felt thin, suffocating. Elias turned. The movement felt sluggish, as if the air in the office had thickened into something viscous. He walked toward the glass door, his boots dragging slightly, leaving a trail of fine gray dust on the pristine carpet. He did not look back at the desk. He did not look at the monitor. He reached the heavy door and pushed. The transition was instantaneous. The silence of the office was shattered by the roar of the factory floor. It was a violent, rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the soles of his feet and up into his chest. Elias stood at the threshold, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The smell of hot oil and splintering wood filled his lungs. The conveyor belt moved with a jerky, uneven motion, the metal teeth of the machines biting into the raw material. He walked toward the center of the floor, his head bowed, the noise rising to a crescendo. He was back where he started. Elias stopped at the primary conveyor belt. The machinery hummed with a frantic, uneven vibration that rattled his teeth. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface of the passing timber. His hand closed around a piece of raw bamboo. He pulled it from the line and held it up to the harsh overhead light. It was a disaster of a stalk, bowed nearly 2 inches in the center. In any other week, his muscle memory would have snapped into action, sending the piece flying toward the reject bin, but his arm remained frozen midair. He turned the wood over, feeling the grain, the uneven knots, and the stubborn resistance of the material. A strange, cold clarity washed over him. He looked at the reject bin, now overflowing with the consequences of Marcus's cheap procurement, and then back at the stalk in his grip, the frantic, desperate need to fix, to calibrate, and to save the yield evaporated. He did not toss it. He did not mark it for disposal. He gripped the wood with both hands, his knuckles turning white. He was no longer a guardian of the process. He was the architect of its end. Elias stepped forward, his movements precise and devoid of hesitation. He positioned the warped stalk against the intake mouth of the primary press. The machine was designed for straight timber, and the wood fought back, its curve pressing hard against the steel guides. He did not adjust the pressure. He did not check the alignment. He shoved the wood forward until the metal teeth caught the edge. The press shuddered violently. A low, guttural groan erupted from the hydraulic housing as the machine struggled to force the curved wood into the narrow mold. Elias stood his ground, his eyes locked on the point of impact. The metal teeth began to grind against the raw, uneven surface, sending a shower of orange sparks spraying across the floor. The rhythmic thud of the factory line faltered, replaced by a high-pitched whine of tortured metal. He watched the wood slide deeper into the press, the machine vibrating with a new, dangerous intensity. The frame rattled, and the smell of burning friction filled the air. He did not pull his hand away. He watched the machine labor, the internal gears straining against the impossible shape, and he did not blink. The press was failing, and he was the one who had fed it the poison. The grinding sound deepened into a harsh, metallic scream that echoed off the factory walls. Thick, acrid smoke began to curl out from the hydraulic motor housing, staining the air with the scent of scorched oil and burning wood. The machine bucked, the entire frame swaying on its concrete anchors as the metal teeth tore into the stubborn, warped fibers of the bamboo. Elias stood perfectly still, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He watched the emergency stop button, a bright red circle of plastic just inches from his reach. It was a simple, mechanical solution to the chaos unfolding in front of him. He did not move. He did not reach out. He watched the sparks turn into a steady, glowing stream that licked at the internal wiring. The rhythm of the factory floor had completely collapsed. He felt the vibration of the floor through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic pulse of impending destruction. He stared directly into the heart of the machine, his expression unreadable. As the grinding grew louder and the smoke thickened into a dark, suffocating cloud, he was the only person in the room who could stop it. The press gave one final, bone-shaking heave. A piece of flooring slid out onto the conveyor belt, but it was ruined. The wood was splintered, crushed along the edges where the mold had failed to contain the curve. It looked like jagged, shredded debris. Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fine layer of sawdust and metal filings that now covered the floor. He picked up the mangled plank. It was hot to the touch, the surface scarred by the grinding teeth of the machine. He held it up, watching the light catch the uneven, jagged edges. The machine behind him let out a long, wheezing hiss, followed by the sharp snap of a drive belt breaking inside the housing. The motor sputtered and died, leaving the factory floor in a sudden, ringing silence. Elias dropped the useless plank back onto the belt. He looked at the wreckage of the press, the smoke still rising in thin gray ribbons toward the ceiling. He felt no panic. He felt no urge to fix the damage. He simply stood there, watching the cooling metal, knowing that the cost of this failure was now written in the broken frame of the machine itself. Elias turned his back on the cooling press. He walked past the rows of silent, idle machines, his footsteps rhythmic and steady against the concrete. He did not look back at the smoke-filled aisle. He reached the heavy exit door, pushed the steel bar, and stepped out into the cool night air. Behind him, the factory sat in total stillness, the broken equipment standing as a silent testament to the false efficiency Marcus had championed. Tomorrow, the production line would remain dark, The repair costs would mount, and the procurement savings would vanish in the face of a total mechanical collapse. Elias walked toward the parking lot, his pace unhurried. He left the building behind, knowing that by morning, the truth would be impossible to ignore. He reached his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the wreckage for the men who valued numbers over the reality of the floor.